It's Pythian, but it doesn't matter. So yeah, welcome to why we recommend PMM to our clients. Who am I? I am, as said before, I am Matthias Crauwels. I live in Ghent in Belgium. I have a bachelor's degree in computer science, and I've been a Linux user and administrator for about 20 years. In my professional career, I started as a PHP developer at the university where I studied. And from there on, I was the backend developer and the one responsible for the databases and became the Mysql DBA there. About a little over a year ago, I joined Pythian as a MySQL database consultant, and currently I am the lead database consultant on my team. So I'm responsible for a team of 8 to 10 database consultants, giving them a technical escalation path and helping them with their work. I have a boy who's 5. You can see him on the picture there. One little disclaimer, I am not a regular operations guy. I am a DBA, currently working as a consultant. But I'm a strong believer in observability, monitoring, and knowing what's going on in your database in order to troubleshoot issues and improve performance. And so that's why we are using PMM, and I will tell you a bit about it, but first a little about our company, Pythian. So we are a data-oriented company. Our logo says, love your data. So we started off about 20 years ago as an Oracle consulting company, and then we added SQL Server, and recently also MySQL and other open source technologies. We are working in different environments. So we do operational data systems, we do analytics, we do cloud migrations and operations. We have partnerships with all the major cloud vendors. So yeah. So agenda for today, introduction, doing that right now. Then first, what is PMM? What are the components and how it's architectured? How do you install it and how do you tune it? And then why do we recommend it? Why do we use it? So let's get started. So PMM is an acronym for Percona Monitoring and Management. It's an open source platform for managing and monitoring MySQL and MongoDB performance. It's developed by Percona, but it's using a lot of open source technologies. The current version, when I made the slides, is 1.15. Maybe they released 1.16 recently. They have a conference going on right now in Frankfurt also. But yeah, so the core components for PMM are Prometheus and Grafana. So they use Prometheus as their primary data store for all their time series data. And they use Grafana for visualization, and it's also the primary web interface when you browse to your PMM installation. Then they have developed their own query analytics system. They call it Quan, Query Analytics. Yeah. They collect metrics to analyze query performance over time. They introduced Console for service discovery, and then they have Orchestrator for topology management and visualization, although it's not enabled by default in PMM, but it's a very useful tool that we use very often, but usually we use it separate from PMM to have more control over what it does and how it works. Then you have on the client side, and obviously the client side is your database server. From the PMM perspective, that is the client sending metrics or for which you're collecting metrics. So you have two types of exporters currently. You have pull-based, which is the default, I think, for Prometheus, where you have the default node exporter that collects Linux system metrics and pushes they get pulled by the PMM server. Then Percona has updated the Mysqld Exporter for MySQL and InnoDB metrics. This is also based on the community edition, but I think they've just forked that and added some features. I'm not sure if they're going to contribute that back, but I believe they will. They have a similar thing for MongoDB, so MongoDB metrics, and they created a proxy SQL exporter for proxy SQL metrics, which is a very popular MySQL proxy in the MySQL community these days. And then you have a number of push-based metrics, especially related to Quan, where your agent pushes metrics for the statistics to the Quan engine. So this is the architecture overview for PMM. So you have the biggest part is the metrics monitor, where you have Prometheus and Grafana, which is your primary purpose for installing PMM. And Prometheus just pulls metrics from all these exporters. And here you have the push exporters for the query metrics who push to the Quan database. And then you still have the Quan endpoint in the web interface, but in recent versions they have integrated the dashboards for that into Grafana. And then you have Orchestrator standing next to it. But as I said, that's being disabled by default. And then they have created a little Go tool called PMM admin they use for administrating the services monitored by PMM. And so this tool will eventually update their console service discovery data, where you can easily, the tool provides a useful interface for adding new metrics or for verifying that everything works. A little note here, the console endpoint is available, but it's not recommended by the documentation to use that directly without the PMM admin tool, because they do some other stuff with that. So PMM admin, a little sample here. A very easy command is PMM list, where it lists all the services that are currently monitored. So first you can see which the address is for your PMM server, how your client is called, and how the services are managed locally. And then you have a list of services that are currently active on this machine. So obviously this is a MongoDB server, so you have the Linux metrics and the MongoDB metrics enabled. You can see the ports locally where they connect from, and then you can see the data source. The default is localhost for Mongo on the default Mongo port, but for the system metrics, it just collects metrics on the local system. So there's no specific data source connected there. Then a very important check here is the check network connectivity. Obviously, your PMM server will be somewhere on your network, and you want to know if everything is okay. So again, here it reports client and server address. And then you have a very important thing is called the time there, because we're collecting time series metrics, most likely from different systems. You would want to have your time set properly, so the metrics in the graphs show up the right data at the right time. It's not important that everything is configured in the same time zone. That will be taken care of by the server. But it's important that there's no drifts in actual time. So there's a check here if the server has time drift, if the client has time drift, and if the difference is too big. So the most common example is if you're pushing metrics and nothing shows up in your Grafana dashboards, this is what you will probably want to look at. There's probably some time drift causing the data to be dropped by the server. Then the next part of the check network output is connectivity from your client to the PMM server. So the client still is your database server here. So this pushes, this is the ability to push data to the server. So it checks connectivity to the console API, the Prometheus API, and the Quan API. And it gives you some time consuming data to see how good your network connectivity is to the server. And then the last part of the check network is if the server can connect back to your client. So you have, for the Linux metrics, you have a port open, and it needs to be able to, the server needs to be able to connect to that port. It's using HTTPS and TLS by default, and there's usually a password configured. In this case, there isn't. This was just a test machine and a test output, but usually you will have a password configured. And the MongoDB metrics here shows a problem, so probably the collector cannot connect to the Mongo server for some reason. So this is something that will need to be troubleshooted. Then we move to installing PMM server. There's 3 major distribution methods available. So there's a Docker image, there's a OVA package, which is a virtual appliance. If you have a virtualization environment, you can just run that one. And then there's, in AWS Marketplace, there's an image available, or an AMI available, where you can, obviously if you're running in AWS, that's where you want to go. It just sets up everything for you. In my experience, the Docker approach is the most popular approach, especially with our clients. Usually they want to have PMM on-prem on their own data center because they have to expose some ports to their database server, and they usually don't want that over the internet. They just provision us with a Docker server, and we can install PMM server there. For installing PMM server, it's recommended to have 4 different data volumes. So you have your Prometheus data, which is obviously the biggest one. So that's where all the time series will be stored. You have the console data for your service discovery. That's a very, very small data store. But for backup purposes, it's useful to have a different volume for there. Then there's a small MySQL instance included in PMM, so there's a data directory, obviously. And then for Grafana, you also have a data directory where the dashboards and everything for Grafana will be stored. At the first run of the Docker container, PMM will initialize all the data directories and set the privileges right at this time. So if you're trying to create the volume mappings at the first run, probably your installation will fail. So it's recommended to run the first time without the volume mappings, then stop the container, move the data into the appropriate volumes, and then start the container again. That's the little workaround that we've been using. I know that someone is working on getting that fixed, but I'm not sure how far along they are with that. So then, obviously, you might want to tune your PMM server, because Docker, by default, allows you to access as much memory as there's available. And if you run multiple containers on the same Docker server, that's not always what you want. So for Docker, you can add the dash memory and then a number of gigabytes parameter. So then the container will only use that much memory. And also by default, Prometheus will allocate all the memory available, which is also not the best idea ever. So you can also limit this by setting the metrics memory. This doesn't allow specifying the 2G notation, so you have to calculate, I believe that will be megabytes, how much memory you want for that. Then, by default, Prometheus stores the time series data for 30 days and Quan for 8 days. If you want to change that, you have to give an environment variable in the number of hours you want to have retention for your data. And then the default is also to have 1 second sample rate for your metrics. You can change that by setting to 5 seconds in this case. That will significantly reduce your storage footprint, but that will also reduce the observability, and it will flatten out a lot of the issues that you will be troubleshooting using PMM. So I would not recommend doing this. I would keep that at 1 second and maybe lower the retention value or expand the volume. But 1 second sample rate is very useful. So this brings us to why PMM. In a lot of cases, we get called in by our clients, like we have a problem right now, and we don't know how to solve it. So if we have visualization of the metrics, what's going on inside the database, we will be able to respond much better, because they say we have a problem right now, but right now it's usually 5 minutes ago. And so, yeah, what was going on, what was running, how do we figure out where we need to start looking. So having visualization and historical monitoring is very useful. So PMM has a lot of built-in dashboards for MySQL and MongoDB, where they have collected all the metrics for InnoDB and for MySQL and for MongoDB. They graph them out, they put them together so they're useful. And so we can easily identify issues that were happening inside the MySQL server. Then another thing, it's open source. There's a lot of commercial tools available that can offer similar kinds of monitoring solutions. Usually that's software as a service. The previous speakers, they talked about Datadog. New Relic has some database plugins. There's Vivid Cortex. There's a lot of great tools, but in a lot of cases they are pretty expensive. They are mostly pay-per-server solutions, and so if you have 500 servers, that bill can be quite high. So in this case, you just need a big server for monitoring 500 servers, but in the end, that will be cheaper than buying you a subscription to one of those vendors. In a lot of those cases, your data is shipped off-site, and a lot of people and companies don't want that. They want their data on-premise, so PMM supports that. And it's also depending on your internet uplink from your backend servers. Since we're monitoring database servers, they are usually not so exposed to the internet or not have the best internet connectivity, because obviously your web servers will have a good connectivity because they serve your website traffic, but the database servers will be on the back end and will most likely not be exposed to the internet. So if you have a commercial software as a service solution, you will need to have an uplink from your backend servers that is strong enough to support all those metrics being sent out. And in the end, those solutions are usually not so customizable. All those things can be resolved by PMM, because PMM runs inside your own data center, so it has your local backbone as the link to it. You can easily customize it. I said it's a Grafana, it's a Prometheus. All the components that these tools offer are there, so you can use them, and you can customize them. Then again, security. PMM runs inside our network, so that's a big advantage. There's SSL communication by default between the client and the server. It's a Docker or an appliance, so you can easily set it up using existing infrastructure. If the client has a virtualization environment, you can just drop in the appliance. If they want to supply you with the Docker server, you can just run the Docker container. There's HTTPS authentication included by default. Obviously, the examples I showed before did not authenticate, but that was just a test server on my local laptop. And you can do a completely custom setup to your needs. It's flexible. There's multiple options available. You can, as I said, you can choose local appliance, Docker. The PMM client packages are available as for each major operating system distribution. So there's DEP packages, there's RPM packages. You can download the source code. You can add custom dashboards if you want. So there's a number of predefined dashboards that will allow you to troubleshoot. But if you say, like, we have some extra metrics that we want to push to Prometheus there, you can easily create an extra dashboard or realign some graphs so you can troubleshoot more easily. And you can also monitor other services because it's just a Prometheus that is running there with the Grafana in front. So if you say, like, hey, I have this application and I want to push some metrics there, it's all possible. Next reason why we recommend it, it's extremely easy to set up. I think within 10 to 15 minutes you can have your PMM running. Everything is pre-configured. The Grafana will automatically connect to Prometheus. If you use the check network command, you will directly see if all the communication is working. So you just set up your collectors, and you're started. And then since Grafana 4, there's alerting. So since Grafana is a core component and PMM has all the metrics you want, you just define your thresholds and you push out the alerts from Grafana. You don't need any other alerting tool no more. So that's also a big advantage for us, where some of our clients did not have monitoring to the database at all before. So we just add one PMM container. It provides observability to the database, and you can push out all the alerts that are required. Just put a paging service behind it, and you're off to go. So, any questions?
Okay. How about when it's going to high availability or scalability? How is it done? Is it possible with PMM at the moment?
Yes, you can. We set it up for a client using Kubernetes. So we have multiple servers available in our Kubernetes cluster, and so the pod just moves to the other nodes with a network file system attached for the data.
Like all the other Docker orientated software.
All the
stacks.
Docker high availability stacks can work here.
Right. Good. And a second one, is there a license policy with PMM?
As far as I know, it's all GPL.
It's all GPL, so I can use it as often as I want to.
Yep. There's nothing like the MariaDB business license there. It's just open source. You can just download it all, or you can just download the packages for the OVA or the Docker image.
So I will. Thanks a lot.
Hi. Since the scrap time is quite small with 1 to 5 seconds, how you have the storage? Do you have a small retention time with only 1 to 4 days and have long-term storage attached, or how do you solve this issue?
I didn't catch it all.
This is a scrap interval. It's quite small with 1 second, and if you have a lot of data with 1 second, you run into gigabytes very fast. Yes. And if you have a retention time for the TSDB with about 30 days or so, that can get quite huge, the data you collected.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a small retention time locally and some remote read storage, or you only keep short-term data, or how do you solve this issue?
In our experience, we just lower the retention time to fit within the data volume. So we usually ask the client to expand the volume if possible, and if not possible, then we will lower the retention time. So we keep what we can. I'm not sure if Prometheus supports that. Maybe anyone else knows. I'm not the Prometheus expert here.
You can attach some TimescaleDB, InfluxDB for remote read storage. So then you have some other database features like downsampling for very old data. I mean, you don't need a 1 second resolution for the last year.
Yep. So if Prometheus supports that, I'm sure that you can implement that in PMM also. So because there's just a Prometheus there, you can just use all the features that are available. So basically, when you set it up, you get an admin account to Grafana and an admin account for your Prometheus. You specify your own roles that you can use within those tools. So you can specify everything there that's available within those tools. And if you can do that in Prometheus, then you will probably be able to do that in PMM too.
One question about alerting.
Yes?
Are there predefined alerting rules?
No. There's nothing predefined right as of this version. I know that there's a ticket open for that within PMM. So there's some requests from the community to add some predefined alerts, but currently there is none.
With Prometheus, there's also the possibility to define alerts via Prometheus.
There's nothing there currently implemented. So it's possible to do that, but you have to do it and configure it yourself. It's most likely because it's hard to predefine a threshold for a one-size-fits-all solution. The previous guys also said it. It's not always the best option. So that's why I think Percona right now chooses to not have alerting enabled by default, but you obviously can. by setting your own thresholds.
Question: does PMM also support the forks of MySQL, like the MariaDB one?
Yep. So they fully support MariaDB, Percona Server, Mysql Community Edition. In the recent versions, they also added support for PostgreSQL. So if you're using that, you can also start using it. But that's still very, very basic. So they're building that up as they go. Percona is just entered the Postgres landscape. So they are adding features each new release for Postgres, but currently they primarily focus on MongoDB and MySQL, all the versions.
And is there special support for the Galera clustering of MariaDB?
There
like
is Galera support,
replication issues and things like that? Okay.
Yeah, there's Galera. There's some Galera metrics there.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep. And then, oh. I have some trivia. So I have some dashboards I collected. So here on top, you have the InnoDB. I can't read that. InnoDB transactions. And here you have MySQL questions, the number of queries. InnoDB buffer pool requests, InnoDB buffer pool IO. Obviously, I did something here. That's the same time. So what do I have changed? So you see that my transactions and my number of queries is about the same size. My buffer pool, the first one is the pages read, and the second one is the pages written. The pages written sometimes spikes, but the pages read has dropped to 0. The buffer pool read requests, before any read request was a discrete. Now the discretes spike here a bit, and then they drop to 0. And then here you have the OS waits. So before there was a lot of waiting for the operating system. Now this has also dropped to particularly none. So what would I have changed here? Buffer pool size. So I started this MySQL server with default buffer pool size of 128 megabytes. I increased it a little bit to 3 gigabytes on a 4 gigabyte machine. So that's the kind of things that you can see from PMM. Then another one here. So you have performance schema file IO. And you have the InnoDB buffer activity and the buffer InnoDB IO. So not only my reads have dropped, but my writes have also significantly dropped. This requires a little bit of insight in InnoDB. I changed my InnoDB log file, redo log file size. It was also 64 megabytes to instances, so 128 megabytes. Every 128 megabytes, it had to write to data files. I increased my log files to 1 gigabyte each, so my write traffic now dropped to almost nothing. Just every few seconds, it needs to flush when the 1 gigabyte gets filled. So, yeah. Thank you. These are my contacts. We are hiring. If you're interested in working with us as a DBA, please contact us. Otherwise, you can contact me directly. Yep.
Thank you very much. Are there like one or more questions? Because I need to ask if there are some questions, because I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
I didn't get to did you work with like the Grafana alerts? I didn't had the time that you can like have something which prevents you from like annoying if the graph is going over the threshold and then goes under and over and under, like some flapping.
So flapping, I haven't played it with it that much. I have my colleague mostly to work with that. He's more experienced with Grafana, so I would have to ask him.
All right. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Okay.